we obviously see a lot of different language about God in Kabbalah. And so there are two main words or concepts of God in Kabbalah. One is infinite God, God and God's self. And this is where God is called Ein Sof, which in Hebrew literally means infinite or without end. The other and arguably more important version of God that we read about in Kabbalah is God's emanated self. So this is the God that humans can interact with, and this is what we're reading about or hearing about when we hear about the Sefirot. The Sefirot, which just means the emanations, the Sefirot include the way that infinite God somehow made a version of God's self that it would be possible for humans down here to interact with. And this is really incredible because it's kind of a change, and it really pushes back against some ideas that you would read about in philosophy, both in broader philosophy, whether in Greek philosophy, Arabic and Muslim philosophy, which Jews were reading at the time. Many of the people working on that were their neighbors, where there's an idea that if God is infinite and perfect, that humans can't affect God, that God's unchanging, that that's part of what it means to be eternal. But the Sefirot are profoundly affected by human behavior. And so we see in the Sefirot a different explanation or an additional, because it never really jettisons earlier ideas simply of commandment. But we see this additional explanation of why keep the commandments, and it's because these affect God's life, God's inner life, God's existence in the entire universe. And the Sefirot also give Jews who are praying something to think about, something to meditate on as they try to understand God. They have to always know it's a metaphor, and yet we have these emanations. And so the Sefirot, we've seen maybe maps or drawings with different circles that then have all kind of different networks that energy would flow through. So the first emanation is Keter, the crown, and this is simply God's decision to create basically a finite version of God. So it's still so large, right? We hear Kabbalistic texts talking about measuring different parts of God's body. And this is one answer to the idea of what it means to be created in God's image, is that there's a way of thinking of this emanated finite version as being God with a body. But still, like, just God's tongue is long enough to measure the length of just our universe, right? Not even to speak of other universes. So if I can't think of infinity in my head, I still can try to focus on this vastness. It's finite, but it's so big. It's so much bigger than I am. And so paradoxically, I think the language allows for thinking about a finite God in a way that actually leads to almost conceptualizing infinity. So God decides to make a finite version, and then each of these lower Sefirot is a further emanation of other of God's characteristics, of wisdom, of beauty. These are words that we know are all over the Hebrew Bible, right? So these are also connected with thinking about the vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible. And then it goes all the way down to the lowest Sephirah, which is the singular in Hebrew. The lowest Sephirah, or emanation, is often understood to be the Shekhinah. So in the Hebrew Bible, and then even more in rabbinic texts, the Shekhinah is God's presence on earth. And in Hebrew, the word is feminine, which doesn't always mean exactly one-to-one something about our gender, that's not how language works for languages that have gender. But in this case, people practicing Kabbalah and in the text of the Zohar, the idea that the Shekhinah is feminine is really, really important. There's another emanation above it that's understood to be masculine, that is understood to be something like God's phallus. Because when we think about creation, how do humans create? We create through sexual interaction. And so there's a kind of sexual, or I think more appropriately, erotic language in the Zohar that describes the creation and energy, that uses language like human sexuality to describe what's happening within the emanations. And that when humans specifically when Jews keep the commandments, this activates that energy, that it causes goodness to flow. It causes a lot of activity in these different emanations. So God and God's self is kind of activated, and then this brings down good things to the human world. So with the Zohar, we begin to see an idea of the Sefirot as an understanding for why keep the commandments, as well as an understanding of what is the nature of God, that there is, in fact, an infinite God that really we can't understand. That's Ein Sof. Ein Sof is infinite. But what are Jews supposed to do when they think about God? There is this emanated version of God, sometimes called the Godhead, or sometimes some kind of demigod. It's not really God and God's self, but it's an emanated version that is something that our human, material, finite world can interact with.